Ever really thought about the energy powering your daily life?
Yeah,
That gas in your car, the electricity lighting your home. I mean, our modern world just runs on it.
it really does.
But have you ever stopped to consider the powerful, often unseen forces that actually determine its availability, its price, and even its impact on our environment and politics?
It's so easy to take for granted, isn't it? But behind every flip of a light switch or, pump of gas, there's a truly intricate web of influence at play. A really complex system.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we try to unpack complex information and make it clear and insightful for you.
Hope so.
Today we're diving into the fascinating and sometimes pretty controversial world of big oil in the United States.
Mm.
Our exploration is built from a comprehensive study conducted between late 2014 and 2015.
Right.
And our mission today is to understand that intricate web of influence. Everything from the industry's immense economic power to its significant political footprint and the often baffling regulatory landscape it navigates.
Yep.
You'll discover how the quest for oil and gas shapes not just our energy future, but our environment and our politics too.
And what makes this particular study so insightful, I think, is its foundation. It's got original qualitative research, lots of interviews with experts across the country, plus a standard social science look at the existing literature.
Okay.
So it gives this unique perspective, looking through the lens of these complex regulatory regimes, and all within this really unusual context of sharp drops in oil and gas prices during that exact study period.
Oh, interesting. So that economic backdrop must have colored everything.
Absolutely. It definitely adds another layer.
So when we say big oil, most of us probably picture, I don't know, one giant monolithic entity, like some kind of cartoon villain sometime.
Right, exactly.
But this study reveals a fascinating first insight. Big oil isn't just one thing. It's actually, well, two very distinct, powerful kinds of entities, each with their own unique footprint. So what exactly is big oil today, according to this research?
Yeah,
Yeah.
precisely. The popular image often misses these really key distinctions. On one hand, you've got the vertically integrated super major firms.
Okay.
Back in 2014, these were the 6 global giants really dominating the markets. ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips, those are U.S. headquartered. And then you had Royal Dutch, Shell, BP, and Total, which are European-based but do significant business here.
Right.
It's worth noting, though, that ConocoPhillips actually shifted from that super major category to being more of a large independent by late 2014.
Oh.
But these are the companies that really do everything, from exploration and production all the way through to refining and marketing, the whole chain.
And then there's the other meaning you mentioned, the large independent producers. How do they really differ from these super majors or even, say, the small local firms?
Well, they're definitely distinct from the mom and pop small firms, which, like the name suggests, have very few employees, limited production. These large independents, they're often described as the real entrepreneurial force in the industry.
More nimble, maybe?
Exactly. Known for moving quickly on opportunities. Now, the term big oil itself, you're right, it often carries this negative connotation. Historically, it's linked back to that 19th century populist opposition to powerful trusts.
Right, like the railroads or Standard Oil back then?
Precisely, suggesting this concentration of economic power that's maybe wielded against the public interest. That's the baggage the term carries.
Okay, so we've got these powerful players, different types, but how exactly are they regulated? The regulatory landscape for oil and gas development sounds anything but simple.
Oh, it's not.
And it seems like it shifts dramatically depending on whether you're talking onshore or offshore operations.
Yeah.
Let's start with what happens on land.
Right. So onshore regulation is incredibly complex, mostly because it varies so much from state to state, even though there are common federal requirements overlaying things. The study focused on 10 major producing states, places like Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, North Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, California, and Alaska. A real cross-section. And each one has its own unique approach.
Wow, that's a huge range of places.
Yeah.
What makes their regulatory approaches so different then? Is it just politics?
Well, politics is part of it, but it's more than that. You've got factors like geological conditions, what kind of oil or gas is there, how easy is it to get. Then there's how much the state's economy relies on the industry. Very different in Texas versus, say, California.
Okay.
Industry concentration matters, the state's political culture definitely plays a role, and even specific constitutional or legal differences. Like you mentioned Pennsylvania earlier, they have what's called the rule of capture.
What's that?
Basically, whoever brings oil or gas to the surface owns it, even if it technically flowed from under someone else's land nearby. And that often gives subsurface owners, or the companies leasing from them, a really strong hand in shaping how things are regulated. You also see just a wide variety of agencies involved at the state-level commissions departments,
Right.
like the Texas Railroad Commission, which is famously not about railroads anymore.
Right, heard that one.
Or North Dakota's Industrial Commission, California's Department of Conservation, Pennsylvania's DEP. It's different everywhere.
And the federal government isn't completely absent here, right?
Right.
Which agencies typically get involved onshore?
No, definitely not absent. You've got the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, which is huge because they manage federal public lands, handling leasing, permits, and they have trust authority for Native American lands, too.
Okay.
The U.S. Forest Service often works with BLM on policies. Then the EPA gets involved with discharges, water quality issues, and they have agreements, MOUs, with states. And even agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, dealing with the Endangered Species Act or the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, plus the Army Corps of Engineers if you're talking about dredging or filling in navigable waters or wetlands. It's really a mosaic of federal oversight, often working alongside or sometimes overlapping with state agencies.
Okay, so that's onshore sounds like a patchwork quilt of regulation. Does stepping out to sea into offshore operations simplify things at all? Or does it just introduce a whole new layer of complexity?
Well, in one way, it simplifies the jurisdiction. Offshore is primarily federal territory, generally starts 3 miles offshore and extends out 200 nautical miles.
Great, the EEZ.
Exactly. Though there are some specific exceptions, like for Florida and Texas and the Gulf, and there are 4 main outer continental shelf, or OCS, regions. But the Gulf of Mexico, it accounts for something like 97% of all U.S. OCS oil and gas production. It's dominant.
97%, wow.
Yeah. You've also got some limited prospects off the Pacific coast, mostly Southern California, and then Alaska, which is the largest OCS region. Geographically, the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, seen as a frontier area with high potential but also high risks and costs. The Atlantic, not much happening there currently.
But as we move offshore, the story gets really interesting and frankly tragic sometimes. The landscape of regulation seems dramatically reshaped by these singular catastrophic events. Tell us about the 3 spills that really fundamentally changed the game.
They absolutely did. You really can't talk about offshore regulation without talking about them. The first big one was the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969.
Okay.
It was a blowout from a Union oil platform. Huge amounts of oil washing up on those beautiful beaches. It was a massive turning point. Public outrage was immense.
And the consequences.
It directly led to landmark environmental legislation. We're talking the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA.
Right, NEPA.
The creation of the EPA itself, the Clean Water Act, California, passed its own version, CEQA. It basically launched the modern environmental movement in many ways. Sierra Club membership doubled in California, and it led to a long-term moratorium on new offshore leasing in state waters there. A fundamental shift.
Wow. Then, 20 years later, another name everyone knows, the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989.
Yeah, up in Alaska's Prince William Sound. A tanker hit a reef. Not a drilling accident this time, but transportation. Still devastating. Killed nearly 300,000 seabirds, maybe 3,000 sea otters. Huge ecological damage.
That's awful numbers.
Terrible. And that prompted the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, or OPA 90. That brought significant safety improvements, particularly for tankers, like requiring double hulls. Seems basic now, but it wasn't standard then. It increased liability, too.
And then more recently, the one that's probably freshest in many people's minds, the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, the largest environmental disaster in U.S. history.
A truly, truly devastating event. The BP Macondo well blowout in the Gulf, 11 lives lost on the rig itself, then months of oil gushing into the Gulf.
Unbelievable images.
Yeah. A national commission investigated and blamed systematic failures in risk management by BP, Halliburton, and Transocean, the main companies involved. And critically, from a regulatory standpoint, it resulted in the complete dissolution of the Minerals Management Service, or MMS.
Why dissolve a whole agency?
Well, there were serious allegations of regulatory capture, basically, that the agency had become too cozy with, too influenced by the very industry it was supposed to be regulating. They were seen as promoting drilling and regulating safety, which many saw as a conflict.
Oh, okay.
So MMS was broken up and restructured into three distinct agencies, each with separate budgets, separate missions. BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, handles the leasing and environmental reviews under NEPA. Then BC, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, focuses purely on safety rules and compliance inspections. And finally, ONRR, the Office of Natural Resources Revenue, just collects the royalties and fees.
So trying to separate those potentially conflicting mandates?
Exactly, trying to create clearer lines of responsibility and independence. There's no doubt these spills, each in their own way, mobilized environmental groups, fueled public concern, and forced significant safety improvements across the industry. They were wake-up calls.
So on one side, we have this powerful, complex, regulated industry.
Yeah.
On the other side, we have this diverse array of groups representing, let's call it the land and the public interest. Let's talk about how industry represents its interests first. They sound incredibly organized.
Oh, they are. Very. At the national level, the big player is the American Petroleum Institute, API. It's the oldest, founded way back in 1920, and the largest oil and gas association.
How big?
Over 250 staff representing some 640 member firms, headquartered right in Washington, D.C., as you'd expect. They started out focusing on things like standardizing, drill pipe, thread counts, technical stuff. Now they have hundreds of technical standards, but a huge focus is on business-government relations.
Lobbying, essentially.
Lobbying, lawyers, economists, regulations, scientific affairs, communications, the whole package. And it's important to remember their membership is diverse. It's not just the super majors. It includes smaller firms, refineries, service companies.
So given that diverse membership at API, how do they navigate issues where their members might actually have competing interests? Are there any surprising examples of that kind of internal tension?
Oh, definitely. That diversity means they often have to take nuanced positions or sometimes struggle to take a position at all. For example, the study mentions API generally favored state regulation over national standards for hydraulic fracturing. That was generally okay, but could create friction.
Any other examples?
Well, think about something like the lesser prairie chicken being considered for endangered species listing. Different members might have operations in different areas, some affected, some not. So API has to tread carefully. They can't always present a completely united front, though they try.
Interesting. And who else is big nationally besides API?
The other major one is the Independent Petroleum Association of America, IPAA. As the name suggests, it was formed specifically to represent the independents, often in reaction to big oil.
So the non-supermajors.
Right. They have about 8,000 members, including many of the top 75 independent producers. They have less funding than API, a smaller staff. But they really leverage their members' own lobbying strength back in their home states and districts.
Makes sense.
And there are other national associations, too, focusing on specific sectors, like NOIA for offshore or NGA for natural gas, though NGA actually merged with API in 2016 after this study period. But API and IPAA are really the dominant national voices.
Okay, now the study also digs into state-level associations, which seems like where a lot of the regulatory action happens. And these seem to reflect the concentration of the industry in those states.
Absolutely. The landscape varies a lot. You'll find some states where basically one dominant association takes the lead role, especially in places like Wyoming or Alaska or North Dakota, where the industry might be geographically concentrated or dominated by fewer large players. Like who?
For example, the Petroleum Association of Wyoming, PAW, they were a lead plaintiff challenging those new BLM fracking rules we mentioned earlier. They filed legal briefs, really front and center.
Okay.
But then you have states, maybe with more diverse geology or industry players, where you see two main associations, often with a clear contrast between groups representing the independents and those more aligned with the bigger integrated companies or refiners.
Where would you see that?
Colorado, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma are good examples. You might have COGA for independents in Colorado, and then another group maybe more focused on majors. In Louisiana, you have LOJ for independents and LOFA, often seen as closer to the majors and refiners. Same pattern in New Mexico with IPANM and NMOJ, or Oklahoma with OIPA and OCOJ.
And do they clash sometimes?
They can. The study gives a fascinating example from New Mexico. The independent group, IPANM, actually left the other association, NMOJ, because NMOJ wouldn't take a strong position on lifting the crude oil export ban back then.
Why not? Because NMOG also had refinery members, and U.S. refineries generally didn't want the export ban lifted, they benefited from access to cheaper domestic crude oil. So the producers wanted it gone, the refiners wanted it kept. Shows you the internal divisions.
Really highlights the different business models within oil and gas.
Exactly. But sometimes these groups do find common ground and collaborate. Like in Oklahoma, the study notes OCOGA and OIPA worked together on addressing the seismicity issues the earthquakes linked to wastewater disposal. That was framed as sort of enlightened self-interest. Better to work together on a state solution than risk federal intervention.
Right, and then there are states with even more associations.
Yeah, places like California, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Texas, unsurprisingly, has like 5 different trade associations reflecting different segments of the industry, geographic focuses, all sorts of things. And in Pennsylvania, with the Marcellus Shale boom, the Marcellus Shale Coalition, or MSC, became a major player really quickly. Huge staff, big budget, partly funded by very high membership fees, especially for seats on their executive board, attracted a lot of the big players moving into the region.
Okay, so that's the industry side. Highly organized, well-funded, operating at multiple levels. Now let's switch gears to the groups representing, as we called it, the land, or environmental and public advocacy interests. What are some of the major national players here, and how do they operate?
Well, the national environmental NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, they use a variety of methods. Litigation is a big one, suing agencies or companies. Engaging directly in the rulemaking processes, submitting comments, testifying, public education campaigns, and mobilizing grassroots support.
Who are some of the key groups mentioned?
Earth Justice is often focused on litigation, trying to keep oil and gas development out of sensitive areas or strengthening regulations. The National Audubon Society, logically, concentrates on protecting bird habitat, so they're concerned about things like pipeline spread or the fragmentation caused by well pads. They often collaborate with other groups.
What about an organization like the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC? How do they typically engage, perhaps differently?
NRDC is also very active in litigation, but also known for really deep engagement with government agencies during rulemaking. The study mentions their work on issues like challenging wastewater injection into protected aquifers in California or development plans in sensitive areas like Wyoming's Atlantic Rim. They dig into the technical details.
And the Sierra Club, they have a long history.
They do. The study notes they've moved, quote, center-left ideologically and really emphasize climate change now. They run these big beyond oil and beyond natural gas campaigns. They're quite passionate and often take a strong stance, stating that, in their view, no state has adequate protections, driven by what one source called righteous passion.
But that strong stance might not play everywhere.
Right. That approach can limit their appeal or effectiveness in deeply conservative or red states. The study gives this striking example of an Oklahoma corporation commissioner who apparently bragged about receiving the lowest Sierra Club rating among candidates, but still winning his election with the highest percentage of the vote statewide. It highlights the political reality in some regions.
But not all environmental groups take such a maybe confrontational stance, right? The Nature Conservancy, TNC, for example.
That's a really important distinction. TNC is huge, very well funded, but generally has a more pro-market orientation. They tend to be non-confrontational, pragmatic, and crucially, they are a very large landowner themselves. They manage or hold easements on millions of acres globally.
So they work with industry sometimes.
Yes. The study gives an example of TNC working with oil companies on siting requirements for wells in Oklahoma to help preserve native prairies, finding common ground. The Wilderness Society is another group focused on public lands protection, often advocating for development to occur in less sensitive places rather than outright bans everywhere.
Okay, so a range of approaches at the national level. What about beyond the big national groups? Are there regional and local organizations involved too?
Absolutely, and they often play a critical role. You have regional NGOs like Earthworks or Food and Water Watch. They're often more specialized, sometimes more confrontational. Food and Water Watch, for instance, was cited as the first national organization to call for an all-out ban on fracking and initiated campaigns like Americans Against Fracking.
More focused, maybe more aggressive.
Sometimes, yes. And then you have the local grassroots groups. These are often closest to the communities directly affected by development. Groups like the Louisiana Environmental Action Network, LEAN. They did crucial work after Deepwater Horizon, like independent sediment and seafood testing, helping with detoxification programs. They also worked on issues around the Bayou Corn sinkholes.
Right on the ground.
Exactly. Or up in North Dakota, the Dakota Resource Council, DRC, representing landowners and community members. They voiced strong complaints about spills, flaring, and what they saw as the state government's unresponsiveness, which they attributed to, quote, ideological or libertarian free market views dominating state politics.
And we can't forget about landowners and royalty owners themselves. Their interests might align with industry sometimes, but clash at other times.
That's a really important constituency. You have the National Association of Royalty Owners in Arrow. They focus on educating people about their mineral ownership rights, negotiating leases. They often coexist pretty comfortably with the industry,
But not always.
not always. Then you have groups like the Texas Land and Minerals Owners Association, TLMA. They've been very active in challenging how companies calculate royalty payments. They basically want companies to show the math on the royalty checks, how deductions were calculated, pricing, volumes.
Seems reasonable.
You'd think, but this demand apparently faces pretty unified industry opposition simply because it means, quote, more work and potentially opens them up to more disputes. Then you also have farmers and ranchers, represented by groups like the North Dakota Farmers Union or the Northwest Landowners Association. They have specific concerns about surface impacts, drilling pads taking up farmland, damage during construction, ensuring proper reclamation, but also impacts on moving large farm equipment, noise, light pollution from drilling sites.
So surface owner versus mineral owner conflicts.
Yes, especially where mineral rights were severed from surface rights long ago, which is common. The study notes that in North Dakota, the legislature historically prioritized mineral owners' rights, seen as key to encouraging development, though they did establish an ombudsman pilot program to help mediate disputes with surface owners.
Okay, when you lay out all these different interests, the powerful industry groups, the national environmental organizations, the local activists, the landowners, the power imbalance becomes really clear, especially financially.
It's stark. The study highlights the significant financial advantage the industry holds, particularly in political campaigns and elections. At the state level, where many key regulatory decisions are made, industry can outspend environmental and public advocacy groups by ratios of like 7 or 8 to 1, sometimes more.
7 or 8 to 1, that's huge.
It is, and the study makes a crucial distinction. This money primarily buys access. It gets lobbyists in the door, gets campaign contributions noticed. It doesn't necessarily mean they're illegally buying specific policy outcomes, but access itself is incredibly valuable in shaping the debate and influencing decisions.
And that money probably goes further at the state level.
Exactly. Political competition is often less intense. Media scrutiny might be lower than in D.C., so contributions and lobbying can have a bigger impact relative to the dollars spent. And of course, the overall partisan orientation of a state, whether it's strongly Republican, red, strongly Democratic blue, or competitive purple, heavily influences attitudes toward resource exploitation versus environmental protection.
It paints a picture of a real uphill battle for the environmental and community groups, financially speaking. But the study uncovered this truly fascinating nuance. During a crisis, like a major oil spill, this financial might, this corporate identity, can actually become a public relations weakness for the industry.
That's such an important point. In those moments of environmental disaster, Santa Barbara, Exxon Valdez, Deepwater Horizon are the prime examples. The industry's for-profit nature, its sheer size and power, can work against it in the court of public opinion.
How so?
Because environmental groups can effectively occupy the high ground. They can more credibly claim to speak for the broader public interest, for the damaged environment, for the affected communities. Public outrage over those kinds of visible harms significantly constrained the political influence of the oil and gas sector, at least for a time. It created windows for regulatory change that might not have existed otherwise.
So their biggest strength, economic power, can sometimes be a liability when things go wrong.
Precisely. It's a key dynamic in this whole interplay of interests.
Okay, now let's delve into how these regulatory systems actually work day to day, or sometimes maybe don't work as intended. We're talking about the institutions themselves, the influence, and this persistent challenge of regulatory capture. Where did these state regulatory regimes even come from originally?
Many of them have really deep roots, often going back to the very first oil booms in those states. In Pennsylvania, for instance, where the U.S. oil industry essentially started, early government was pretty limited, heavily influenced by a laissez-faire, hands-off approach. Today, their Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP's Oil and Gas Division, holds the primary regulatory authority.
And California, they had an early boom, too.
They did, starting around 1875. But they found that existing mining laws just weren't well suited to regulating oil production. And interestingly, there was a lack of significant federal production regulation early on, which really left it to the states to figure things out.
And then there's Texas. We mentioned the Texas Railroad Commission earlier. It sounds like it became incredibly powerful. What's its story?
It's a classic story. The TRC was formed way back in the late 19th century, initially, genuinely, to regulate railroads. But then came the massive oil discovery Spindletop in 1901, and especially the enormous East Texas field in 1930. This created an oil glut, prices collapsed, chaos ensued. The TRC gradually gained authority over oil and gas production.
How?
Their key tool became prorationing. They essentially started telling companies how much oil they were allowed to produce each month. The goal was to stabilize prices, prevent waste, and conserve the resource, although it was hugely controversial at first. After some intense political and legal battles, the TRC emerged as arguably the single most powerful energy regulatory authority in the entire United States for decades. They practically set global oil prices for a time.
Wow. So this sounds like a pattern states reacting to booms and busts. Did other states coordinate their efforts to manage the industry, or did they just figure it out on their own, state by state?
Well, the problems Texas faced weren't unique. That instability, the price volatility, the waste was happening elsewhere, too. So in 1935, the major oil-producing states got together and formed the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, the IOGCC.
What was its purpose?
The main goal was to coordinate state efforts, share best practices, and address those unstable conditions. Historically, the IOGCC was quite influential. They developed model legislation, promoted conservation principles. A big part of their agenda was also to demonstrate that states could handle regulation effectively, thereby preventing federal intervention, promoting a states-first approach.
Keep the feds out.
Basically, yeah. Though the study notes that some states today, like New Mexico, Pennsylvania, California, claim they have pretty limited linkage to the IOGCC now, suggesting maybe its direct influence has waned somewhat over time.
Okay, that brings us to the regulators themselves, the people staffing these commissions and departments. Does it actually matter how they're recruited? Like, are they elected officials or appointed?
The study suggests it absolutely can matter. There's a real split. In some major producing states like North Dakota, Texas, and Oklahoma, the key regulators are directly elected by the voters.
Like the Texas Railroad Commissioners?
Exactly. TRC commissioners have been elected statewide since 1894. And industry campaign contributions to those races are often significant and controversial. In North Dakota, the Industrial Commission, which oversees oil and gas, is actually made up of 3 other statewide elected officials: the governor, the agriculture secretary, and the attorney general. They're generalists, not necessarily energy experts, but they are well-known, accountable officials.
Is there any evidence that elected regulators behave differently?
There are some studies, particularly looking at utility regulation, like electricity prices, that suggest elected regulators might be slightly more pro-consumer, perhaps more sensitive to public opinion, leading to outcomes like lower prices compared to states with appointed regulators. It's debated, but there's some evidence.
So elections could make them more accountable to the public, potentially. What about the appointed regulators, then?
That's the other model. In states like Alaska, Wyoming, and Colorado, governors appoint the key energy commissioners, sometimes with legislative confirmation. They might also include some ex officio members from other state agencies.
And then there's a third way: indirect appointments.
Right. In states like New Mexico, Louisiana, California, Pennsylvania, the primary regulator, like the head of the Oil and Gas Division, might be selected by a cabinet secretary or department head who is a gubernatorial appointee. So it's one step removed from the governor.
Does that appointment process ever cause controversy?
Oh, definitely. The study highlights a notable example in California. The director of the state's Oil and Gas Division, DOGGR, resigned under pressure due to EPA scrutiny over the agency allowing oil companies to dispose of wastewater into federally protected aquifers.
Oof, not good.
No. And then, shortly after, an oil industry executive was appointed as a district deputy within that same agency, which understandably drew significant criticism about potential conflicts of interest.
Yeah, that leads us directly to this whole revolving door phenomena where officials move back and forth between working for the industry and working for the regulatory agencies overseeing that industry. It sounds less like a door and more like a superhighway sometimes.
You could certainly say that. It's a very common observation and criticism in regulated industries. And in oil and gas, some states even require regulators, particularly at the technical level, to have specialized industry expertise, which kind of builds that pathway in.
Are there examples of how prevalent this is?
The study cites a report by the Public Accountability Initiative focused on Pennsylvania during the fracking boom. They identified something like 45 state officials who had ties to the fracking industry. About 17 had moved from industry into government regulatory roles, and 28 had gone the other way from government to industry jobs or lobbying after leaving public service.
45 in just one state.
Yeah, it suggests it's pretty common. And while federal law has some statutory limits on this revolving door, especially for high-level officials, the study found that very few states, Pennsylvania and Alaska were exceptions, had similar limitations. And even where they existed, the cooling off periods were often quite short, maybe just 1 year.
So it's definitely pathway. Given that, how do regulatory systems try to avoid this kind of regulatory capture, this situation where the agencies designed to oversee an industry become, maybe unconsciously or consciously, overly influenced or sympathetic to the very industry they're meant to regulate?
It's a constant challenge. One key way identified is strengthening the agency's mission and professionalism. A clearly defined, specialized mission focused on public interest goals like safety or environmental protection can help professionalize an agency and make it more resistant to capture. The study mentions how Ernest Thompson's leadership reportedly transformed the Texas Railroad Commission decades ago by focusing on engineering expertise and conservation principles.
So mission clarity helps. What else?
Transparency is another big one, making information public. Disclosure rules for things like the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing fluids. The frac focus system is an example, though controversial regarding trade secret claims. Wyoming was actually the first state to require HF fluid disclosure. But the study notes that challenging those trade secret claims can be burdensome for the public or environmental groups. Public access to permits, violations, data that's crucial.
Makes sense. Shine a light on things.
Exactly. And coordination between different levels of government seems important too. How federal agencies like the EPA coordinate with state agencies on permits, sharing information, conducting joint inspections, or even how different state agencies coordinate with each other. Alaska was cited as an example where multiple state agencies, DEC, AOGCC, DNR, all typically comment on proposed operations.
And sometimes industry cooperation can help avoid capture, ironically.
In a way. That Oklahoma example regarding earthquakes and wastewater injection rules is interesting. The industry cooperated in developing new rules and reporting requirements. Was it purely altruistic? Probably not. It was likely, as framed, enlightened self-interest, better to deal with it at the state level with industry input than face potential lawsuits, stricter federal rules, or even bans. It addressed a public concern while allowing operations to continue under new constraints.
Okay, speaking of state versus other levels, the issue of local government authority, especially regarding fracking bans or stricter local ordinances, has been a major flashpoint.
Oh, huge. This creates significant tension, particularly pitting state authority over oil and gas development against traditional local government powers over land use, zoning, and public health. We saw this play out dramatically in places like Colorado, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, Texas. You had cases where local governments, like Longmont City in Colorado, passed bans or moratoria on fracking within their city limits, citing concerns about noise, traffic, air quality, property values, water. But these were often challenged in court by the industry and sometimes the state itself.
And the local governments lost.
Frequently, yes. Courts often ruled that state law preempted local bans, meaning the state legislature had intended for the state oil and gas agency to have sole or primary authority over regulating drilling operations. State legislatures in places like Oklahoma and Texas even passed specific laws explicitly preempting local bans after some municipalities tried to enact them.
So the state usually wins that fight.
Generally, yes, though the battles continue. The study mentions the Colorado Oil and Gas Task Force, created by Governor Hickenlooper in 2014-2015, specifically to try and find compromise between industry and concerned communities. They considered dozens of proposals.
Did it work?
They reached consensus on some issues, but notably, about half of the proposals that would have significantly strengthened local government authority over siting and operations ultimately failed to get consensus. This led to considerable disappointment among local government advocates and environmental groups who felt the process didn't go far enough.
So when you look across the board at these state systems, would you say the relationships between industry and the state regulators are generally more adversarial or more collaborative?
It's a really interesting contrast highlighted in the study. Industry representatives often display significant antipathy or frustration towards federal agencies like the EPA or BLM. Lots of complaints about delays, costs, overreach.
Okay.
But towards state regulators, the study found generally little animosity. Relationships seemed much more collaborative, less confrontational.
Why the difference?
One hypothesis offered is intriguing. At great distances, meaning dealing with federal agencies far away in D.C., wielders of power have no incentive to be civil. But at small distances, dealing with state regulators who they see regularly, maybe live in the same communities, they have every reason to be respectful. Proximity breeds a different kind of relationship.
Interesting psychological take.
Yeah, and it translates into how things work. You see examples of more collaborative state relationships, like in Colorado and Wyoming, where regulators were described as talking about doing things with industry, not to industry, and being willing to offer flexibility on compliance if companies showed good faith efforts. It's just a different dynamic than the often adversarial federal relationship.
Okay, let's move beyond the state level now and talk about the federal arena, Congress, the administration, national policy. How does Congress typically handle energy policy? I know some critics, like Mann and Ornstein, have called Congress a broken branch. Does the study touch on that?
It does acknowledge that debate. The criticisms about extreme partisanship, divided government, making it hard to pass major legislation, members maybe prioritizing party loyalty over finding common ground or strengthening the institution itself. This context definitely affects how interest groups like the oil and gas industry or environmental groups operate in D.C.
Right. Gridlock can be frustrating, but maybe it benefits certain interests.
It can. Sometimes the status quo benefits established players. And the study also points out certain undemocratic procedures, as political scientists sometimes call them, that can give organized interests with good connections an advantage in a polarized environment.
Like what?
One example is the Senate hold. This isn't a formal rule, more of a custom, but it allows a single senator to effectively block action on a bill or, more often, a presidential nomination just by privately asking their party leader not to schedule it for a vote.
One senator can do that.
Effectively, yes, for a time at least. It gives individual senators enormous leverage, and well-connected interest groups can certainly try to persuade a senator to place a hold on something they oppose. Another tool is adding riders to appropriations bills.
What are those?
These are provisions tacked onto essential spending bills that often have little to do with the actual spending in the bill. They're used to set policy, direct agencies, or block specific regulations that couldn't pass as standalone legislation. The study mentions examples like a rider pushed by Senator Murkowski related to Shell's Arctic drilling, or efforts to block the sage grouse from being listed under the Endangered Species Act via spending bills. It's a way to legislate through the back door, often benefiting specific interests.
Okay, so given that congressional gridlock, the Obama administration, especially in its later years covered by this study, 2014, 2015, really seemed to focus on regulatory initiatives through the executive agencies. What were some of the key ones affecting oil and gas?
That's exactly right. With Republicans controlling both houses of Congress after the 2014 election, the executive branch's regulatory agencies, EPA, BLM, etc., became the main avenue for the administration's energy and environmental agenda.
So what did they try to do?
The BLM, for instance, finalized those fracking rules for federal and tribal lands we talked about earlier. Key parts included requiring inspection of well casings to ensure integrity and disclosure of the chemicals used generally via that FracFocus website within 30 days after fracking was completed. It also included a variance process, allowing states with comparable or stronger rules to continue using their own systems.
And how did industry react to those BLM rules?
Strong opposition, particularly from the Independent Petroleum Association of America, IPAA, and several western states like Wyoming, North Dakota, Colorado, and Utah. They sued.
On what grounds?
They argued the federal rules were redundant because states already regulated fracking effectively, that they would increase costs significantly. One estimate was $94,000 per well and drastically slow down permitting times compared to state processes. Their core legal argument was that Congress, in the 2005 Energy Policy Act, had specifically exempted non-diesel hydraulic fracturing from federal EPA regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and therefore BLM lacked authority.
And how did that play out?
A federal judge in Wyoming actually agreed with the states and industry, ruling that Congress had indeed removed this type of fracking from federal control, and BLM had overstepped its authority. The Obama administration appealed that ruling, so it was still tied up in court at the end of the study period.
Okay, what else was BLM doing?
They also proposed raising the royalty rates that companies pay to extract oil and gas from onshore federal lands. The rates hadn't been updated in decades.
Who supported that?
Some Democrats in Congress, conservation groups like the Center for Western Priorities and the Wilderness Society, their argument was straightforward. Taxpayers weren't getting a fair return for resources owned by a public, especially compared to rates charged by states or private landowners.
And the opposition?
Industry argued, predictably, that higher costs would discourage development on federal lands, hurt small businesses, and ultimately reduce overall government revenue if production fell. That proposal was still pending.
Okay, so BLM was active. And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was quite busy too, right? With ozone standards, methane rules, and of course the big one, the Clean Power Plan.
Yes, EPA was central. They proposed lowering the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ground-level ozone smog, essentially. Ozone is formed partly from precursor emissions from industrial sources, including oil and gas operations.
Industry reaction.
API and others launched ad campaigns arguing the stricter standard would be incredibly costly to comply with, potentially hindering economic growth across many sectors. Environmental and public health organizations strongly supported EPA's proposal, citing the health benefits of cleaner air.
Then there was methane. That became a big focus.
It did. Methane is the main component of natural gas, but it's also a very potent greenhouse gas when it leaks into the atmosphere. The EPA proposed the first federal standard specifically aimed at reducing methane emissions from new and modified sources in the upstream oil and gas sector wells, processing plants, compressor stations. The target was a 40–45% reduction from 2012 levels by 2025.
Who was for and against that?
Yeah. Environmental groups like NRDC, Sierra Club, Clean Air Task Force strongly supported it, seeing it as a crucial step on climate change. The industry's reaction was initially somewhat open, acknowledging that capturing methane could sometimes be profitable. But ultimately, major groups like API came out against the specific EPA rule, arguing that the industry was already voluntarily reducing emissions rates, that the rule would impose significant new costs, especially on smaller producers, and that EPA underestimated existing progress.
There was some nuance there too, right? About overall emissions versus rate.
Yes, that's important. While the rate of emissions per unit of gas produced might have been falling due to better technology and practices at the wellhead, overall methane emissions from the whole oil and gas system, including pipelines, storage, distribution, were believed to be increasing simply because production itself had surged so much during the shale boom. So EPA felt federal standards were necessary.
Okay, and of course, lurking over all of this, as you said, was the Clean Power Plan. Just remind us how significant that initiative was in the context of the Obama administration's climate efforts.
It was absolutely massive. The Clean Power Plan, or CPP, was arguably the cornerstone of President Obama's climate agenda, especially in his second term. It aimed to cut carbon dioxide emissions from existing power plants, the largest source of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, by roughly one-third below 2005 levels by the year 2030.
How would it work?
It was authorized under the Clean Air Act based on the Supreme Court's 2007 ruling that greenhouse gases are pollutants the EPA can regulate. But it gave states considerable flexibility in how they met their individual emissions reduction targets through things like improving coal plant efficiency, shifting generation from coal to natural gas or renewables, investing in energy efficiency programs.
And the reaction.
Environmental groups strongly supported it as a landmark step, but it met fierce opposition, primarily from the coal industry. Many utilities heavily reliant on coal, conservative groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALE, and Republican leaders in Congress and many states. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell even took the unusual step of publicly urging states not to comply or submit state plans.
And its fate.
Numerous states and industry groups sued. And in early 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a temporary stay, blocking implementation while the legal challenges proceeded, so its future was very uncertain.
Wow. So a lot of regulatory action, a lot of pushback. Beyond the environmental regulations, transportation safety also became a significant federal issue during this period, didn't it? Especially with the shale boom changing how oil moved around the country.
Absolutely. That's where crude by rail really exploded onto the scene. With the rapid increase in oil production, particularly from the Bakken Shale in North Dakota and Montana, which lacked sufficient pipeline capacity, shipping crude oil by train grew exponentially.
And that led to problems.
Serious problems. There were several catastrophic derailments and fires involving trains carrying volatile Bakken crude. The worst, tragically, was in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, just across the border in 2013, where a runaway train derailed, exploded, and killed 47 people, destroying much of the town center.
Just horrifying. So what did regulators do?
The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, part of the Department of Transportation, came under intense pressure. They proposed tougher safety standards for the tank cars used to transport flammable liquids like crude oil requiring thicker shells, thermal protection, better valves. They also proposed reduced speed limits for these high-hazard flammable trains, especially through urban areas.
Was there agreement on the solutions?
Not entirely. There was actually some infighting within the industry between railroads, tank car manufacturers, and oil producers over things like how thick the new tank car shells needed to be, how quickly the older, less safe DOT-111 cars should be phased out or retrofitted. Environmental groups also sued, arguing the proposed rules didn't go far enough, fast enough, keeping potentially dangerous cars on the rails for too long.
But compared to rail, pipelines are often cited as being much safer overall for transporting oil, right?
Statistically, yes. When you look at incidents per ton-mile transported, studies generally show pipelines are significantly safer than rail or truck for moving large volumes of oil and gas, though pipeline incidents, when they happen, can still be very serious.
So industry prefers pipelines.
Generally, yes. The industry prioritizes pipeline safety and reliability, and a major ongoing goal is building out more pipeline infrastructure to connect new production areas like the Bakken or the Permian Basin to refineries and markets. Though pipeline routing and construction face their own set of environmental opposition and regulatory hurdles, of course.
Okay, finally, before we wrap up the federal section, what about some of the long-standing industry advantages that seem preserved at the federal level?
Yeah.
Things that maybe predate the Obama administration?
The study touches on a couple of key ones. One is the famous or infamous Halliburton loophole.
Say that again?
It refers to the exemption for hydraulic fracturing fluids, except for those using diesel fuel from regulation under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, SDWA. This was explicitly written into the Energy Policy Act of 2005.
And why Halliburton?
It's often attributed to the influence of then Vice President Dick Cheney, who previously headed Halliburton, a major oil field services company heavily involved in fracking during the task force that shaped that energy bill.
Has there been pushback on that loophole?
Oh, yes. There have been attempts to repeal it. The study mentions a Senate vote on repeal that failed largely along partisan lines. There's ongoing debate about its actual significance. Some argue that even without SDWA oversight, states and the EPA have other regulatory tools under different laws, like the Clean Water Act or RCRA for waste, to manage potential risks from fracking fluids. But symbolically, it remains a major point of contention.
Symbolically important. And then there are the various subsidies, credits, and tax breaks the industry receives.
Right. The oil and gas industry benefits from numerous specific provisions in the U.S. tax code that aren't available to other industries or are structured differently. Things like deductions for intangible drilling costs, percentage depletion allowances, credits for foreign taxes paid.
How much are these worth?
The study cites estimates suggesting these could be worth billions of dollars over a decade, particularly for the major integrated firms. For example, the Section 199 deduction for domestic manufacturing was estimated to be worth $14.4 billion over 10 years, just for the 5 U.S.-based supermajors at the time. The foreign tax credit was worth another $7.5 billion to them.
What's the justification?
The industry argues these provisions recognize the unique risks and capital intensity of exploration and production, and that they incentivize domestic production and create jobs. However, critics, including environmental groups and even some fiscal conservatives, argue they distort markets, subsidize fossil fuels, and represent corporate welfare that should be eliminated. Even some Republicans, like Jeb Bush during his presidential campaign around that time, voiced support for phasing some of them out as market distortions.
So, complex politics, even around taxes. Despite all this polarization and these specific contentious issues, were there actually any bipartisan efforts in Congress on energy policy during this period?
Surprisingly, yes. It highlights a strategy sometimes used by congressional leaders to try and overcome gridlock. The idea is to bundle together a package of less controversial, broadly supported energy proposals where some consensus might exist.
Like what?
Things related to energy efficiency standards, promoting infrastructure development like pipelines or transmission lines, those specific projects are controversial, supporting diverse energy supplies, ensuring agency accountability, and reauthorizing popular programs like the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Did they succeed?
The study mentions the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, under the leadership of Senator Murkowski, a Republican, and Senator Cantwell, a Democrat, putting together a massive 357-page energy package bill. It incorporated elements from something like 114 separate bills, including proposals from about 30 Republicans and 20 Democrats. A real effort at finding common ground.
But did it pass?
Getting those kinds of broad packages through the full legislative process is always tough. However, one significant piece of legislation that did pass, though it broke largely along partisan lines but got attached to a must-pass spending bill in late 2015, early 2016, was the lifting of the 40-year-old ban on exporting U.S. crude oil.
Ah, right. Who wanted that?
It was strongly supported by API, free trade advocates, and especially the shale oil producers who were churning out light, sweet crude that many U.S. refineries weren't optimized for. States like Alaska and North Dakota, hit hard by the drop in oil prices, also pushed for it. It was seen as a way to access global markets and potentially get better prices.
Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground today. Let's try to recap. You've really shown us the diverse nature of big oil. It's not monolithic. You've got the super majors, the large independents, and how it operates within this incredibly complex, multi-layered regulatory environment that shifts dramatically from state to state, and certainly between onshore and offshore.
Yeah, and we've explored those often competing interests, the industry groups versus the environmental and land advocates. We've seen the pervasive influence of money in politics, particularly that idea of buying access, and the real challenges regulatory agencies face in trying to do their job effectively and avoid being captured by the industries they oversee.
Right. But it wasn't all negative. We also saw how public outrage, especially starked by those major environmental disasters, and sometimes even the industry's own enlightened self-interest, can actually lead to positive changes, safety improvements, and even instances of collaboration.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic system. The industry's economic power, combined with its very sophisticated political organization, undeniably gives it significant access and influence, especially at the state level where so much of the day-to-day regulation happens. It really is a constant push and pull of interest.
It truly is. And as you mentioned at the start, this study was conducted during a very specific time, a period of sharp drops in oil and gas prices.
Right. That context is key.
So maybe here's something for you, the listener, to think about. How might these fluctuating global energy prices continue to influence that delicate balance of power we've discussed? The balance between big oil, the regulators